So we are at day 322 in the text. Probably today and the next class will both be finishing this sort of subsection on mind training, particularly focusing on taking adverse conditions onto the path, which is how we uh, guard our bodhicitta by not being deterred by difficult circumstances that arise. So I think in one way, this is in the section on the great scope, because, we benefit in order to say that we will actually be someone who really can be truly successful in taking uh, all adverse conditions. Of course, we can begin working with small adversities as they come up. But if we really develop the resolve of being able to transform even great sufferings, great adversities, and take them as part of our training, I think that we depend upon the earlier contemplations and the way that that prepares the mind. But also, there's no point in doing that in the other scopes. The small scope is uh, directed at just good future rebirths, and the middle scope is directed at developing a real, genuine weariness with cyclic existence. So, this wisdom, this kind of training doesn't serve a purpose for a practitioner accomplishing the small scope or the middle scope. It only serves a purpose if a person is a practitioner of the great scope and they are someone who's solidly, fully wishing to engage in the bodhisattva path, um, which is what will come after this subsection that we're in as the training of a bodhisattva, the six perfections, the four means of gathering disciples. The actual training of a bodhisattva will, after we finish all of the sections on bodhicitta, this is a subsection. Are there any thoughts or questions that have come up about last class? So in day 322, Lama Yeshe is going to, the quotation is in a way, it's a relatively short contemplation. The actual quotation talks about not understanding that our problems arise from not understanding what we are or how we exist. And then it says relatively or absolutely. But then, seems like really in the analysis of that quotation, they mainly talk about, in direct terms, kind of more so relative, because really they're sort of talking about impermanence. It's not, they don't directly specifically address emptiness, which would be the absolute part of that quotation. In general, the analysis is talking about mainly ego identity, which is, as we know, related to emptiness. It's what is undermined fully when we realize emptiness directly. But we can reduce, in one way, we can, if we think about what the analysis is asking us to think about, is the changing nature of the self. And that is a helpful precursor in a way, or a helpful segue into emptiness. You could say, well, the fact that 15 years ago And now, those are two pretty different points in time in terms of, the people that I knew, the things I was into. I mean, for any person who's over the age of 15, those 2 points in time, they're going to refer to a personality that's different in reasonably significant ways. Um, a person in their maybe 20s, a lot of people in their 20s are, maybe partying a lot, etc. And then by the time they're 35, maybe they have children. The focus is on their career. Of course, there's stable aspects, maybe their level of introversion, extroversion. There's stable elements of a person's personality as well, but in pretty significant ways, um, the values that people hold, the interests that people have, um, a person's um, you know perspective in the world is shifts pretty drastically over you know relatively intermediate periods of time. And yet, when we're, say, 35 or 45 or 65 or whatever it is, and then we think back to being 10, 15, 20 years earlier, we recognize that um, our hobbies, maybe are different, but we think, oh, I had this hobby when I was 20, and now that I'm 70 or 50 or whatever, now I have different hobbies. Um, but we think it's really the same person, the same ego identity that held those hobbies and those interests and those values, and now is just holding separate. But really, you know, those changes are pretty substantial, um, and they actually, we might um, be unwilling to do many of the things that we did in our late teens and early 20s. We've seen that some things are destructive, some things are not useful. We've given up some things, we've moved in different directions. So the idea that the I is truly stable, and then of course you can go back even further, and we would say, oh well, when I was in grade school, I was really into this kind of sport, or I was really, I thought when I grew up I would want to do this, and I actually ended up doing that. Um, and of course, it just becomes more and more apparent, the longer you look at the self, that there isn't that true core of ego identity that persists even over a single lifetime. That's not emptiness. That understanding, that recognition isn't the same thing as, which is why in the quotation it says relatively and absolutely. So conventionally or relatively, even on that level, the I undergoes dramatic changes over the course of a lifetime. Um, but in any given moment of that, um, we don't have to compare this moment and then a much later moment to see that there isn't an ego identity. When we look at the absolute analysis of emptiness, we can do that without referencing changes in time. You can do that at any point in time. And so it's a different type of analysis. And that's why it's referenced in different ways. It just so happens that really in the analysis of that quotation, they don't really bring in examples of um, of that in a direct way. Um, he says, you know, um, when we clearly see the way in which we hold a permanent self-image, all we can do is laugh at ourselves. It's nonsensical. We believe that we're the same person we were 10 years ago. And then he says that's what Lord Buddha meant when he said that we're deluded, deluded. Deluded means holding and hanging on to nonsensical conceptions and hallucinated projections of ourselves. And as long as we don't eradicate this cause of our problems, we're not doing a good job. So, but that is kind of only looking at it, I would say, through that relativistic lens. There is a deeper level, which is referenced in the quote, that isn't sort of not directly brought in there because it isn't necessary. Like I say, it's not necessary to think about the conventional changes that the ego identity has, that we can observe that the ego identity has undergone, because even an infant, the mind, the body and mind, the ego identity of an infant, of a 2 second, old infant, is empty of inherent existence. So it doesn't, it isn't necessary to do that kind of analysis, but we can, in a way, it's easier to do that kind of analysis and get a taste, get a sense of, well, yeah, and the Buddha says that I'm holding my ego identity in a overly concretized way that is nonsensical. Using the analysis of emptiness is maybe harder to get at, um, but we can, when we just look back over our life, we can see it within a few minutes. We can get some recognition that the Buddha is on to something, that he's presenting something in a way that makes a lot of good sense. And then, but we do also have to actually do, you know, the absolute analysis of emptiness um, at some point too. Uh,
Excuse me, Venerable, is
yep.
he saying that only by having the experience of non-conceptual emptiness, that is the shattering point?
Yeah,
Okay.
there is no other, all of the other antidotes are helpful in various ways. But if we never, the only thing that, Buddhism would suggest that the only thing, the only realization that we've never had is a direct non-conceptual realization of emptiness, because that is the only thing that's actually powerful enough to completely overcome suffering. Um, you can realize, you can have, the realization of impermanence, which is kind of what the other analysis, that's in the small scope. You can do that. Maybe you would want single pointed concentration to really get it, or something close to single pointed concentration, to really get it in an extremely deep way. Um, but you do that, and still you've got all kinds of wrong conceptions that are completely untouched. Um, so in the next contemplation, they sort of switch gears, because again, this is the section on transforming uh, adversity, or mind training. I would say mind training with an emphasis in uh, transforming problems, because it's also true that within the mind training literature, emptiness, and is another major theme. So that was kind of, they're bringing in some slightly different um, aspects of mind training in this section. Um, so in day 323, the quotation is, when we experience sickness or suffering, we should feel as if we just won the lottery. So again, this is working, bringing adverse conditions into the path. Um, So then in the analysis, it says, when we fall ill, instead of getting depressed and obsessed with our illness, which only creates more problems, we should immediately think, quote, I have prayed to take on the problems of others, and I have now received them. I will experience this illness on behalf of all living beings. Uh, so, Lama Zopa is not saying that we ought to make ourselves sick, that we ought to like go around licking doorknobs, but we're going to get sick, from time to time. And instead of that experience kind of taking us off course and giving rise to a sense of, the self, what Lama Yeshe and, they would call the self-pity mind, um, and kind of thinking, because that's the ordinary track that the mind wants to take, is to, to only kind of stay in bed and have soup and watch, Netflix or whatever, and, and never transform that experience, never do anything positive or beneficial or useful with that experience. But those experiences are going to occur, and so if we can try to do what Lama Zopa is encouraging here, and just think, when every time that I've ever done Tonglen, any time that I've done, you know, the Guru Puja, where it says, taking on, the sufferings of others, various prayers and practices that we've done, like this is we can think, now I've gotten the ripening result of that. um, whether there's actually a karmic link there or not, we can say, I've been training in developing the attitude of wanting to take on the suffering of others. And so when I do suffer, if I can label that as having taken on the suffering of others, and relate to it in that way, then that is, instead of energizing my normal track in the mind of, oh, woe is me, and instead, using it to cultivate bodhicitta, using it to cultivate a brave, courageous attitude, um, then, one track is going to, take us in the wrong direction, and the other track is going to create the inner causes and conditions of, um, as we'll see, really being willing to engage in all of the activities of a bodhisattva, really being able to perfect our patience and our joyous effort and our generosity and our ethics, and, so on, all of the, things that a bodhisattva has to subsequently do is going to be bolstered by thinking in that way. Whether we can say truly that we created a karmic link between those two things, still, what we're really doing is creating a sense of resiliency in the mind, instead of a frail mind, a mind that is using the lens of the ego identity, to interpret our experiences. We're using the lens of a bodhisattva to interpret our experiences, and that's constructive rather than destructive.
You mentioned karma a couple of times regarding this topic, and I have heard more than a few times that being sick or having or suffering or having difficult conditions is a way to quote unquote burn negative karma, and I just wonder what your take is on that.
Sure. So I mean, certainly that particular negative karmic seed, once it has run its course, it no longer has any additional power. If we get the flu, for example, um, that flu is going to cease at a certain time, and whatever, negative karmic seed. So I would say, in a way, thinking along those lines, um, in a way, it's different. It maybe that would be a way of thinking um, that might, um, I would say, in one way, it serves a similar purpose in 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 terms of helping us to not relate to that suffering in an adverse way, because in that way we could face it with a happier mind, right? If we hold the idea that, oh well, there was this negative karmic seed in my mind, and if it ripened, for example, in the intermediate state, which isn't too much further down the road, right? That our next intermediate state is coming, and that negative karma, if it ripened then, when the mind and the body are separate, and the mind is in the intermediate state, and it's not bounded by human, the constraints of a human incarnation, where there's only so much suffering that's possible, um, then that suffering could have, it could have been that particular negative karmic seed could have been a fully ripened, or a fully completed karma of killing, let's say. Maybe not, stalking and killing a human, but maybe killing an animal, hunting or something. Um, and still, that negative karma has the power to generate an entire rebirth in the hell realms if it were to ripen in the intermediate state. So that is a way of also not giving in to kind of, again, that self-pitying mind that's like, oh, this is terrible. But instead, like, oh, this is amazing. I really dodged a bullet here, because had it not done this, it would have done that. And that's fantastic that it's finished now. Um, so that's definitely true. This is, I think, um, this way of thinking is different, um, because I mean it is true that, um, like I say, with this contemplation being on the great scope, the idea is that we are seeing our suffering not in the same way as one's own negative karma from a past life, which Buddhism would suggest, often it is, but kind of seeing it in a special way, kind of seeing it maybe not as the ripening of a negative karma, um, but seeing it as the fruition of the prayers and the aspirations that we have made to relieve sentient beings of suffering, and to, the attitude, like the attitude of a mother for her child, like, a mother, when they look at the suffering of their child, if they could take that headache and actually experience it on behalf of the child, they would. And then if they felt like, by my experiencing it, that child would be free of it, they would happily do that. And that's sort of through the power of that aspiration, the power of that prayer, rather than, oh, in some past life I did a mistaken action, and so, this, it's coming back around and I'm experiencing it. That Buddhism would say that that's generally true. Um, but perhaps we could entertain the idea that, um, by the power of my stainless prayers and my, strong aspiration and my training in love and compassion that's embracing sentient beings, that I am in some way, experiencing suffering on behalf of sentient beings. Again, whether, how likely that is to, th- that there's actually a mechanism for most people for that to be that way, maybe high level bodhisattvas to some degree, um, have that as a to some degree of a mechanism perhaps. um, but it's a way of training the mind. It's a way of interpreting what's happening, um, irrespective of whether it's what's actually happening. It's a beneficial, constructive way of interpreting the situation that you're facing, so that it helps you to, it strengthens your love and compassion for sentient beings. Um,
It feels as though this interpretation that we're studying right now is perhaps more engaging. I don't want to blow off the karmic aspect of it, but it feels as though you're taking that more to heart and wanting to establish that.
Yeah, I mean, it's directly connected to bodhicitta. It's part of the great scope motivation. So, because in the other scopes, the small scope, again, the small scope, the purpose is to just be someone who's creating the causes and the conditions for good future rebirths. The middle scope is, trying to overcome any attachment to cyclic existence at all, even good, the positive, the best kinds of experiences. So, um, so yeah, I mean, the great scope is certainly a lot more meaty, in a lot of ways. It has a lot more. That's where great love and great compassion and, all of the perfections, and that's all on the great scope. So, um, and certainly we aspire to be great scope practitioners. So, um, yeah, I think because people who want to practice Tibetan Buddhism, I think the purpose, the reason is because they see the value of the great scope and they're, attracted to the great scope. And so I think in that way it has a certain um, kind of um, quality that's unique. Okay, so day 324, Lama Zopa talks about the five powers, the five powers. So there's, I think, two sets of five powers, and this set is um, talking about the five powers that are part of our life. There's five powers at the time of death, and then there's five powers during the life, and this is the five powers during the life. So the five powers are the power of motivation, the power of familiarity, the power of the white seed, the power of what he calls destruction, of self cherishing, and the power of prayer. Um, so he explains how to integrate these when he says, during our lifetime, we constantly check our motivation to ensure it is as vast and positive as possible. After generating this motivation, for example, in the morning, we do all of our daily activities for others as purely as possible. So that would be um, familiarity. So you begin with the power of motivation, and then you're engaging in actions that are intended to be in line with and harmony with that motivation by engaging. So then you could call those virtuous activities, irrespective of whether there may not be formal practice, but if you've set a motivation to, in the morning, like he says, um, that you're going to use your day to um, generate bodhicitta, then and then subsequently you actually make an effort to, in all of your interactions, think about that person having been your mother, the kindness of that person, except the ways in which they're bereft of true happiness, the ways in which they meet with suffering, whatever it is that you can do as best you can, that all of that effort, even though it's imperfect, it's inconsistent, still you're genuinely you're striving, you're making an effort to engage in actions that are concordant with your motivation, your virtuous motivation. um, then you are engaging in the power of familiarity, the power of acquaintance. And then from that, the power of the white seed emerges, which is really sort of the momentum that you build up, the merit. You could say momentum, or you could say merit, day by day by day, by engaging in the power of motivation, the power of acquaintance or familiarity, that generates the power of the white seed, which just kind of means that slowly, gradually over time, you internalize being someone who has those kinds of motivations, who engages in that kind of virtuous effort. Now, of course, if we don't start off with motivation and we don't do anything that's concordant with motivation, then the power of the white seed won't flow from that. But if we are setting virtuous motivations and then we're striving as best we can every day to engage in actions that are harmonious with that motivation, we internalize all of those positive. And so some of that is formal practice, of course. Some of that is formal study, formal meditation, but some of it is just daily life activities as well. But the more that we're doing all of that, then merit is what arises, this kind of energy, this momentum, due to the force of those habits, those familiarities. Um, and then, um, and then he says, when a problem occurs, we immediately remember that it has been caused by our own selfishness, and heap all the blame onto it, the selfish mind, the egoistic mind, the self-cherishing mind. That's the power of destruction of self-cherishing. So driving, remember, the previous um, quotation of driving all blames into one, driving all blames into the self-cherishing mind. Um, and then finally says the power of prayer involves dedicating the merits from our positive actions to develop bodhicitta. So, at the end of every day, we uh, dedicate whatever virtues have arisen from all of that positive motivation, all of that power of familiarity, and so on, and the power of destruction. All of these virtues we dedicate as often as possible, and that's the power of prayer. There's other kinds of prayers too. Um,
This may sound a little corny, but it I know that all of this makes life sweeter.
okay, so those are the five powers. Any thoughts or questions? Okay, so then the last contemplation for today will be day 325, which is, again, kind of very similar to what has been discussed. The thought of liking problems should arise naturally, like the thought of liking ice cream or music. Um, it's just Lama Zopa Rinpoche's quotation. And then in the analysis, it says generating a brave, determined attitude is extremely important for our thought transformation practice to succeed. With this strong motivation, we proceed to train our mind until we become like an experienced horseman. Even though their mind may be distracted, they're able to manage the horse effortlessly, no matter what it does, without falling off or endangering their life. They are able to cope because their body responds naturally to um, to the way the horse runs. So um, yeah, so if we continue to give in to this aversive mind, this mind that labels challenging circumstances as a problem and something that we have to be separated from, um, then in terms of the great scope, in terms of actually completing the collection of merit and wisdom that we need to complete to actually give rise to the bodies of a Buddha, we won't. We will fall short. We will be, as it says, we'll be taken off track through the meeting of miserable conditions, which are naturally, unavoidably going to arise. So we need a skillful approach to being able to. We can't prevent, difficult circumstances from arising, and so what we do have to prevent is those difficult circumstances completely obliterating or degenerating our bodhicitta, or preventing it. When we observe the terrible things that sentient beings can do and maybe did do to us, to people we love and care about, and so on, people we're close to, um, if that gives rise to hatred, if that gives rise to, or if, we just become someone who gives up sentient beings because we think it's too difficult to amass the, as I say, the collection of merit and wisdom, and we think that it's too overwhelming, it's too. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that you can just jump right to the great scope. Of course, that's not. We have to understand that this is the great scope, and it depends upon having been successful in the small scope, in the middle scope. So really, we're talking about someone who's qualified to be engaging in these contemplations, someone who's prepared their mind, and whose mind is, the right kind of mind to take up this kind of training. There's certainly a danger in taking on too much too quickly. If we think, oh, well, you know, in this lifetime the Buddha gave up his life, and in this lifetime the Buddha, this person carved, flesh from their body, and then we're like, oh well, I'll try that. That sounds, that would be a terrible mistake to, to think that we're in a position to give up the body, to, or to even, harm the body in a, serious way in order to bring some benefit. Because yes, it's true that a person can accomplish that. That doesn't mean that we are right now capable of accomplishing that. And going too far, or trying, even just doing some big action that we end up really regretting, that's maybe just with our possessions or our wealth or something, thinking, that we should do that. And then if it doesn't go our way, if people don't care about it, or they don't respect it, or we don't get acknowledged, then we could be like, well, forget these people, I give up. It's too hard. So progressing in a very logical way is still, of course, critically true. But eventually, at some point, this is a stage of development that we will go through. We will become someone who, as Lama Zopa says, the thought of liking problems arises naturally. It is, it's because when he says naturally, what he means is, um, it's not forced. It's not a convention. It's not something. It's not something that person's white knuckling. They have prepared their mind. They have cultivated the realizations, and now it does arise naturally and spontaneously. Okay. Um, any thoughts or questions? I guess there's time for one more. So in day 326, it's a short contemplation where he says if we practice properly, the result is peace in our mind. So then he says, if through having recognized the false conception of ego and attachment, we develop pure motivation and dedicate our life to others, our life will become truly worthwhile. We will give real meaning to being alive, and our relationships with those around us will be much better. We don't have to change anything external. The only change is within our own mind. So in a way, Lama Zopa always, has talked about um, making one's life meaningful in a way that is unique, because as a human, we certainly, and this is um, kind of going against the eight worldly concerns that Geshe Dundrup is teaching on, and focusing instead on these really meaningful things, um, and how that's the only way in which we come to possess a life of real meaning, because otherwise, um, we're just looking for comfort and wealth and status and reputation and power, and and that's the point of. And for many people, that is the point. For many on the earth, that is what all of their energy and their effort is directed toward, is just amassing greater wealth, having greater status, um, you know, um, being able to control people or situations, or to have a place of authority, or what have you. And all of their actions are geared toward getting that kind of place in society, or achieving a particular level of any of those things. And usually it's all of those things in one degree. You want a high degree of wealth, and also a high degree of comfort, and a high degree of social status, and so on. So um, but as Lama Zopa points out, all of the other non-human sentient beings that we share the earth with are also doing that. They're also only motivated to avoid what seems difficult, to move toward what seems pleasant, to, be treated kindly by the sentient beings around them, to be supported, and, to feel a sense of ease and comfort in their external environment. That's what all sentient beings are trying to do. So there's nothing unique about that. There's nothing special, um, and it doesn't translate. It doesn't create. It doesn't go beyond this life. You can do all of those things, um, but then what have you done that actually transfers over into the next life? You haven't really created new tendencies and habits and familiarities that are beneficial in your next life, or even beneficial in generating, your next life, beneficial in the intermediate state, in the bardo. um, yes, David.
Venerable. Kind of speaking on that note. Well, first off, I want to say sorry. I was at work, and I usually sign in at like 4:30 or 5. But kind of kind of on that note, though, I wanted to ask. I have like a pretty strong attachment to like pleasurable food and kind of like controlling food. I mean, I've struggled with not kind of like an undiagnosed eating disorder in the past, like having to really, and it's gotten a lot better with Dharma practice and kind of contemplating um, pleasure in general, I would say. But I just wanted to kind of ask how the monks and nuns view food. Like, is there? I'm kind of unfamiliar with like the process of, I guess, like receiving the food. I think there's a book that uh, I guess Lama Zopa wrote called The Yoga of Offering Food. I haven't really read that much of it, but I was just wondering if you could kind of give me some, or give us, I guess, some kind of insight as to how monks and nuns treat food, and perhaps like how Dharma practitioners should do so as well.
Hmm. I mean, I think it can be a little bit tricky, if there is, um, you know, I if there is a disordered relationship with food, then I think it can be a little bit maybe more tricky, and I certainly think um, that there are, that Buddhism doesn't necessarily um, address, um, maybe all of the best ways for every, for that sort of thing. I think that there's certainly value, important value, in the experts, who focus on that from a medical perspective, and so on. So I just want to, make sure that, um, that I would say that the advice, that is given in Buddhism, isn't necessarily addressing any kind of, um, maybe, pattern that might be, in a way disordered, that's beyond maybe what is more so typical. And so certainly seeking advice, is important from people who have real expertise in that. um, One way that it can be very helpful in, um, not thinking about it in terms of this, a strict, like, pleasure is bad kind of way, um, is to think of the whole process. We've looked at, in various modules, looked at, um, one aspect of that being thinking of the cooking of the food, the buying of the food, the eating of the food, kind of the whole process as being part of an offering, to, one's own teacher, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, um, in general, the holy beings, the Buddha Dharma Sangha, however a person kind of wants to think about that. um, and so then Venerable Urbina says, if you have that kind of approach, then the more pleasure that you engage in, the better, because you're thinking of it as not like pleasure in a hedonistic way, but you're thinking about offering something pleasurable. You're thinking about that the pleasure that you're experiencing is the pleasure of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who are receiving your offering. And so that can be a very helpful way of kind of not identifying that pleasure in a in terms of one's own ego identity, but thinking of it, kind of removing oneself from that process without labeling, this is good and this is bad. um, so I mean, because I think definitely everyone, I mean, even I think there are very few people that are actually living in monasteries. The food in monasteries is generally pretty simple. I would say, monotonous. They don't have a lot of money, and certainly it's quite simple and quite monotonous. And so they just kind of learn to, you know, based on that. Um, but I don't think that that's strictly necessary. Most people who are monks and nuns are feeding themselves. And so, still, that impulse to, why would I eat something that I think is gross, certainly is still there in the mind. Um, and then, of course, there is an element of eating what one is given, also, if a person is a monk or a nun. And that's a training that people in general can engage in, like whenever you go to someone's house. uh, you didn't cook the food, and it may not be your own preference. It may not be exactly, the kind of food that you most enjoy. um, but to focus your mind on their kindness in offering it to you, and not judging it, not saying, well, this isn't, I mean, of course, if you have an allergy or something, then you shouldn't, eat food that's going to harm your body. Um, but barring that, if it's just kind of not the style of cooking that you would prefer, holding your mind, and again, still thinking of it perhaps as an offering, but also thinking about the efforts that they went to, and doing that, rejoicing in the same way too, in the efforts of the people who planted the food, the people who harvested the food, the people who transported the food, housed it, made sure that it was free, did their best to make sure it was free of pathogens and so on. There's countless sentient beings involved in the production and distribution of the food that we eat. We kind of think, well, I deserve, it's my money, and so it's, of course, you have to give it to me because I paid for it. But still, there's countless sentient beings whose labor, whose time, whose energy, whose effort has gone into making that available in a safe, um, and nutritious way that is prolonging our life. And by prolonging our life, we're able to study, and so on. So I would just, my caution is just kind of in terms of anything that might seem restrictive, in that kind of way, that that's maybe something to be cautious of. Um, but certainly there are, ways in terms of rejoicing and offering, and then having an equanimous mind. So those are the three things that I would point out in particular, would be rejoicing, offering, and having a mind of equanimity. Uh,
Thank you for that. Like, very, not to like, we just talked about the worldly concerns, not to like give you any praise or anything, but I really appreciate that very like complete answer. So thank you very much.
okay, so any other final thoughts or questions? Okay. There will be a couple classes this month that are going to be canceled. Two, because they overlap with a puja. which I'd rather kind of not, make people do. And then also there's Thanksgiving Day. So I think there's three classes this month that aren't, unfortunately, not happening for those reasons. But I do still think that we're on track to finish by sometime in December. I don't think we'll go beyond December. All right, so we'll end with dedication, one of the 5 powers. So bring to mind our virtuous motivation, again, one of the 5 powers, and think that by engaging in the class, we've actualized that positive motivation. By actualizing it, we've also engaged in the power of acquaintance, power of familiarity. So now we're engaging in the power of dedication, and which is the power of prayer, and think that by actualizing that motivation, we've generated positive energy, and that positive energy will ripen in beneficial ways. So very strongly visualize and offer your practice in spiritually meaningful and supportive ways, that you are sealing and offering your practice. All right. So we do meet again on Thursday. Have a good evening.
Thank
Thanks
you very
very
much.
much.